Well, thank you. Welcome, everybody. I'm very glad to be here with all of you. My name is Jeff Kelly Lowenstein. I'm the founder and executive director of the Center for Collaborative Investigative Journalism, or CCIJ. And at CCIJ, we really work to bolster democracy by bringing together visual, data, and investigative journalists as equal partners to carry out ongoing projects of key global issues. We have a strong commitment to working with and learning from individuals, families, and organizations in under-resourced and underserved communities. And we have a very strong commitment to training and to giving journalists who might not, pardon me, have the chance to participate in global investigations, the opportunity to do so. And so I want first to thank all of you for being here. I want to welcome Kehinde and Yuki, who have just come in. And I want to thank Fola Folayan for her work in organizing and promoting this session. And I do want to acknowledge and apologize for the confusion last week. We got the time zone wrong. I take responsibility for that and apologize that set things off by 1 week. So I'm very glad you're all here. Now, I'm particularly happy for this session because in a lot of ways, and I was saying this last week, it brings together the best of CCIJ. We have Yafa Frederick, who is our founding editorial director. We're celebrating 5 years as CCIJ. We'll have a virtual online birthday party in November. Everybody is invited, so we'll make sure to get you those details. And at this point, Yafa and I are the two people at CCIJ who have been there from the beginning, and we also worked together in the couple of years before in the projects that led up to CCIJ. So Yafa will be the facilitator, and we have Freddie Clayton and Sonia Smith. And Freddie and I had the great privilege to meet Freddie in person last year at the African Investigative Journalism Conference, and we had already worked together on 3 different projects over the course of 6 or 7 years. And so Yafa and Freddie had worked very well together on one project. There was a little bit of a leftover, and that became the basis for this project, which of course you'll hear much more about in a minute. And then of course, Sonia Smith and I met in 2019 at the African Investigative Journalism Conference. We were getting things going with CCIJ. We talked. Sonia instantly followed up, had worked on several really important and impactful projects on her own. And then when this one got going, Yafa had the excellent instinct to say, well, Freddie's going to be coming in from outside the country. Let's make sure we can draw on Sonia's expertise. And so you'll hear more about some of the dynamics and issues that arose from the collaboration. But the team, along with Margaret Courtney Clark, worked together extremely hard over the course of a big chunk of time, did an absolutely spectacular project that was a landmark within CCIJ and that also made real and direct impact outside and in the real world. So for me, it's just a thrill to be here and be able to be with all of you and to be able to introduce Yafa, Freddie, and Sonia, and to really say that what we're talking about is how to bring cross-border investigative journalism to life. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Yafa as the facilitator. As I mentioned at the onset, I teach on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so we'll need to sign off. But please join me in welcoming all of you, but also our 3 wonderful facilitators.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And on behalf of Freddie and Sonia, we're really appreciative of you attending our session today. Just to give you an overview, you'll hear me talk for the first 10 minutes or so to just talk through some of the fundamentals of what we did. But then the majority of this is really a conversation with Freddie and Sonia about how, in a very practical way, when they were working on this 3-part Namibia series, they went about doing it. With Freddie, I believe, being based in Spain at the time, and Sonia in Namibia, and our CCIJ team spread out across, I think it was like 6 time zones in total. But why we think it was sort of, the juice was, worth the squeeze, if you will. So in terms of the agenda, one of the things I've always found in journalism is that we assume everyone has a shared definition of words, but that's not always the case. So we'll define how we're thinking of cross-border investigative journalism. We'll talk through what some of the advantages and disadvantages to doing it this way are, how we've navigated through some of those challenges, and then we'll get into that practical Namibia example, which was really looking at Namibia's dire sanitation issue, where it ranked 6th in the world for open defecation at the time, where nearly half of Namibians didn't have access to a toilet. And we'll do the Q&A that I will lead, and then we will be sure to leave at least 15 to 20 minutes at the end of the session for questions from you. So if you do have questions, please write them down, and at the end, we'll be sure to go through them as well. So, oops, sorry. Defining cross-border collaborative journalism. So the way we think of it at CCIJ is we have 2 or more journalists, generally speaking, based in different countries and often in different continents, to cover a story in a more comprehensive manner than either one of them could do individually. And it sort of plays on the strengths of each and the resources of each to create a story that we think, A, has cultural nuance, and I'll get into why I think that's important in a second, takes into account the history of a country, but also takes into account sort of the contemporary realities within that country that may be standing in the way of progress on issue X. But the real key is it's 2 or more journalists not in the same place. And I will say, as a Western journalist, one of the biggest advantages I see to it is that we are able to avoid the parachuting effect. So many Western journalists from Western media, you sort of see them, a British journalist go to Zimbabwe for 2 weeks, then go back to the UK and file a story. And the criticism on the ground, I've experienced this reporting, particularly in Southern Africa, has been there's all of this nuance that gets lost. And, the British journalists came and only spoke to the people in power and didn't do any grassroots work and didn't speak the local language. And all of those elements of it that just make it a very surface level story. We want our story to be multi-layered. And that means that we need people on the ground in the countries we're reporting on, not just in Western countries. So combining, as you'll see, Freddie and Sonia's prowess with Margaret Courtney Clark, who's a Namibian photographer, really took, I think, the story to a level it wouldn't have gotten to if Freddie had done it on his own, or even if Sonia had done this on her own. It also allowed us to pool resources. At CCIJ, we provide a lot of editorial resources, but we were able to plot for additional funding with Freddie from the Pulitzer Center. And we were able to pull in their expertise reporting in different countries, again, to tell that. Language barriers, for sure, can be issues. And like I said, when you have locals on the ground, you don't have to hire fixers necessarily to do all your work. And we felt, particularly with Namibia, we wanted to do a broad-reaching story that didn't just focus on one township or one rural area, but showed the scope of the problem across the country. But one of the other things I think, investigative journalism can be traumatic at times. I mean, you're witnessing sometimes the worst parts of society and people. And I think having a support network of people who are going through that with you, who you can talk through those things, is actually quite powerful. So, Freddie, Sonia, and Margaret were able to kind of be each other's support network. And they did witness, and maybe they'll share with us today, some pretty amazing and tragic things along the way. Freddie did go down to Namibia for a period of time to work on this story, but he didn't have to go back to Namibia multiple times. And part of the reason why, when we had to do additional reporting, is because we had Sonia and we had Margaret. And that's really important when you have those people on the ground. So you can save money doing this too. But the last piece of it, and to me, this is often the most important, is you can reach a wider audience, right? If Freddie is based in the UK and Sonia is based in Namibia, they can publish in publications across those 2 countries. And you combine it with our CCIJ network, where we have partnerships with 6 papers across Africa, and you have much broader reach than either one of them would have had individually. And I think that's really important, because sometimes these stories are local, but they have international implications, or the international community can be a part of those solutions, and those stories need to get in front of members of that community. So, of course, with every advantage, there are disadvantages. One of the biggest ones, and at CCIJ, this is most prominent, we often bring journalists together who've never worked together before. Freddie and Sonia had not, as an example. And like any new job, you've got to build trust with your reporting partner to be able to do it effectively. That takes time. And in investigative journalism, sometimes you have a little bit more time than you do in daily breaking news, but it is a barrier to building trust, especially when you have people coming from different countries and cultures. And perhaps most acutely at CCIJ, we can attest different time zones. It makes it challenging to find the time to have FaceTime, even in a virtual capacity. But it's really important because often you have differences in reporting and writing styles. I know that as an American journalist, when I was first reporting in South Africa, I sort of crashed head on into this. And it took me time to adjust and figure out, like, well, how is journalism taught in this country versus the country where I learned how to operate? And what are the ethical standards that are upheld? I know when I was reporting in the UK versus the US, there are different norms around undercover reporting, as an example. And it's no different than when you're going between Europe and Africa. So those differences can be tension points. But I will say this. There are ways to overcome it, and Freddie and Sonia will go into this in their own explanations, but my big thing is always doing the work on the front end. We didn't just say, Freddie, Sonia, off you go after introducing them. There was actually a 6-month, I'll call it incubation period, where they were really building their relationship together. They were refining the initial pitches Freddie had, expanding the scope of it, kind of pouring through some of the data around it. But it also gave them time to brainstorm potential issues that might come up. How do you navigate it? I mean, obviously, there are always going to be things when you're in the field that you could never have anticipated and you have to react to in the moment. But some of those writing differences, that reporting differences, you can talk through those on the front end and sort of set a game plan of how you're going to attack it when you encounter it in the field. So I want to get into Namibia pretty quickly, but to give you an overview before I turn it over to Freddie and Sonia, this was CCIJ's most ambitious project to date. It was a 3-part series that published in May 23 of last year, examining the horrific state of Namibia's sanitation system. Like I said, nearly half of residents didn't have access to toilets. It was in the top 10 list for open defecation rates across the entire world. And it was an outlier in the region. I mean, the other Southern African countries were far ahead of Namibia on this. So why was the problem so acute? This 3-part series had massive impact. Credit to Freddie, Sonia, and Margaret on this. The Namibian government, who for years had paid lip service and had written documents about how they were going to deal with the problem, finally actually started to deal with the problem after this reporting came out. But it was quite a team that we had to pull together to make it happen. So we, of course, had Freddie and we had Sonia and Margaret as our Namibian journalists, but we had a CCIJ team behind. And I haven't even listed all of the CCIJ team we had. I worked as their investigative reporting editor. I'm based in Texas now in the United States. Our visual editor was based in Philadelphia at the time, and our data editor was in Greece. And we also had fact checkers, legal review, our design person. So we were spread out across, at any given time, a minimum of 6 time zones, just the CCIJ team. And that was before we brought the Freddie and Sonia time zones into the equation. So the overview is Freddie had pitched the story in May 2022, and the reporting happened in November 2022. And that's what I mean about you sort of want that honeymoon period before you're in the field together. There were 6 months where they were really working on refining pitches, applying for additional funding, expanding the scope of the story so that it wasn't just about one township or one city, but that it really encompassed the full country, and mapping out that reporting plan, because when Freddie ultimately went down to Namibia, they had a month really to capture a lot of what they had been doing, sort of the pre-reporting work on. Now, when Freddie came back, that's when the writing process began. And our writing and editing process took also 6 months. And that was because we realized that they had such a wealth of information, and figuring out what to include, when to include it, how to even tell the story. Is it one story? Is it multiple stories? That took time. And again, we were working across at any given time, those 6 time zones and at least 4 countries. Probably by the end, it was closer to 6 or 7 countries. But we put in the work, and that's why I started by saying we put in the work and we saw the impact. We saw the Namibian government actually make changes. So that's sort of the overview. But now I will sort of slow down my pace of talking and turn it over a little bit more to Freddie and Sonia with some Q&A. So Freddie, if I can, I'll start with you because the idea sort of germinated with you. When we first told you, we want to introduce you to this Namibian journalist who we worked with, Sonia. What was that first introduction like? And did you two sort of immediately connect, or did you have to really work to kind of build that chemistry?
Sure, and thanks so much for the introduction to both the project and to myself. Yeah, so that initial introduction, essentially, I was just delighted because obviously the prospect of taking, I don't think I ever would have thought or been kind of arrogant enough to think I could do this kind of thing, single-handedly at all. I mean, it would have been insane. And so to find out that CCIJ had a relation with a journalist in Namibia, I was obviously incredibly relieved almost to know that there would be this kind of support. If and this is still in the early stages. This was before we knew we had Pulitzer funding. It was really kind of just still working out the scale of what we had the capacity to do. So in that period when Sonia enters the project, it just becomes this like, okay, so this is just another absolutely crucial moment where at that point you sort of start to think, okay, this is possible. So, and that's when we talk about the kind of the collaborative element. It only really became even worth imagining once that sort of early team was formed. And I'll admit, I think we were introduced over email in a kind of sort of more ordinary way, but then I think at some point, Sonia, I just jumped on the phone to talk about, we're both people who do CCIJ investigations as well as other things. Sonia was sort of juggling, as she'll say in a moment, I'm sure, jobs as well. So we were sort of just chatting on the phone about being excited about the project and about what we could do, I remember, but also just trying to work out, well, what 4-week period in the next 6 months could we both possibly be free for, which is again a challenge we might get into later. But I just remember being excited at that moment and thinking, okay, great. Those are the moments. Obviously, I think it's such an overlooked part of being I've been freelance for years, and I never have colleagues. It's such a lonely thing at times. So it's really nice to obviously have just immediately made that connection, and then you just think, okay, it's go time, and that sort of introduction was really the catalyst for everything that came after, I suppose.
Yeah. And Sonia, curious to hear it from your perspective at the point we brought you in on a story that you weren't necessarily expecting to be a part of at that point.
She's on mute, Sonia.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hi, sorry. Go ahead, Sonia.
Yeah. So hello everyone. Thank you so much, Yafa, for the opportunity to be a panelist on this training. I remember being first introduced to Freddie. I think it was in June 2022. Our editorial director Yafa did that introduction. And, I was excited about the project. And obviously, there was not really awkwardness when we finally met with Freddie in person, as we have been in constant contact for months before meeting one another. But as a freelance journalist based in Namibia for many years, and I'm used to working alone, it was an exciting experience for me to finally be in a team, because I didn't only work with Freddie, but also another local journalist who is a photographer, an experienced photographer. So we shared a lot of different perspective and experience, and it was an exciting project. And we had one goal, and that is obviously to work on this project diligently and also complete it, effectively. So everything went well, and we worked together. Just the introduction, from the point of being introduced via an email to meeting, it was an exciting, move for me to be part of this project.
Yeah. And we were grateful that both of you accepted.
Yeah.
I want to talk about that period of time though before you were on the ground together in Namibia. And Sonia, maybe we can start with you this time.
Yeah.
What sort of work, I mean, you said you were kind of constantly in contact, and Freddie sort of alluded to some of the conversations you were having. What were you doing to build the relationship with each other and also expand the scope of what Freddie had initially pitched? Because the story evolved quite a bit from the initial pitches.
Well, my experience, so to say, was that you, uh, I think Freddie made a lot of research on the project and also the topic itself on sanitation. So um, during the period when we started talking to one another, and up to the time when we met in person, when he flew over to Windhoek, Namibia, we concentrated on a number of issues, and that is obviously the topic focus. In this case, it was the sanitation. We also discussed, the coverage plan. How are we going to put our efforts together? As the British journalist he is, and I'm based here in Namibia. Like you spoke about, how do we do things here in Namibia, and how do they do it on the other side? So we had to bring all those skills and knowledge together. We also wanted to know, how do we engage people on the ground back here in Namibia. We also had to have, proposed sources. Who do we speak to? We needed, government officials, councillors. We needed to speak to people on the ground, and in which parts of the country should we travel to speak to the people. We also, one of the things that we concentrated on is the experts of sources. Who do we reach out to just give that extensive, view or overview on the proposed topic. Also, the other thing that we discussed is the list of publication in which the investigation was to appear. We had to write letters to these publications to obviously a request for consent for our investigations to appear in these publications, and we had to do that a few months before we worked on the investigation. So those are the things that we really concentrated on, that we thought were critical to the investigation, that we thought were needed to be done on time and during the executions of the project.
Freddie, is there anything you want to add building off of Sonia's work?
Yeah. It's fun, like, hearing, because there were some things in there that I had sort of forgotten, I suppose, where I remember we had a spreadsheet, a shared Google spreadsheet, where essentially, and this was, I would just say, so on my part, I had kind of I had done stories on water before and sort of sanitation adjacent things, and was just researching that as a side, but it just has no sort of, as Yafa was saying earlier, no cultural context. There's no cultural context or frame. I'm just sort of researching a topic in the ether until Sonia kind of brings that into its kind of Namibian frame. So when we sort of started to talk about that kind of thing, Sonia says, okay, because she obviously knew, I'm discovering for the first time that, sanitation in Namibia is bad, and Sonia knew all this already, so she was able to say, okay, well, we go to these places, and then so we had a spreadsheet, and then I just said, okay, based on my research, I think these we need to speak to these kinds of people. And then Sonia would say, and then she would again sort of narrow that down a bit. Okay, but in amongst that bracket that you've given, here are some people we could speak to. So it was just that kind of process of each of us offering up, between us, me having the kind of more subject specific knowledge and her having all of the Namibian knowledge and all the contacts, to eventually use that to collaborate and to break it down into a much more specific and linear plan. Because actually, looking back, I do think it was quite impressive that we were able to put together a 30-day schedule, which is how long I was there for, where essentially every single day had a different interview. I mean, it was just darting around the country, doing these really long drives, and it went very smoothly, that period of reporting. And that only really happened because we got on it so far ahead of time. I mean, we had these interviews organized months in advance, to make sure that there was no wasted days. And that was just all that early pre-prep. And I will later go on to say that part of the thing I struggled with was not having missed loads of stuff in that pre-prep, but that's just because it was so colossal, and again, you don't know how it's going to turn out, the scale of it. But at the time, I think that organizing the reporting was very smooth. And as Sonia said, when we met, it felt like we'd already met, because obviously we'd spent so much time kind of planning this sort of 30-day period around both of we got to the north, to the east, and into the middle, and not just being like, okay, let's speak to one person in each of these places. We spent a week in each of those places. So I don't think we could be challenged having sort of just, oh, you just spoke to one person or whatever. And it was like, we got to actually see how bad it was for a month. So, and just linking back to the question, that was because we spent months just kind of thinking, how can we best capture the scope of a country in a crisis?
Yeah. And I think, well, you both have alluded to certain realities on the ground. So let's jump into once you're on the ground together. It sounds like the pre-reporting process was actually pretty smooth, or as smooth as you could hope. What was it like? And Freddie, maybe we'll start with you this time. How did you work together once you were finally in the same place? Did you face any challenges while you were covering? I mean, like you said, you were driving a lot around this country together, spending a lot of time in cars together, I'm sure. So did you encounter any issues, and how did you navigate them when you did?
Well, to start off with, I mean, when I got there, Sonia, you were in South Africa, I think, at the time, because again,
Yeah.
you have other jobs. We had there were, you can't just drop everything for a month, obviously. Like, I was also doing other work whilst I was there. So I was actually, I don't think we met for the first 10 days I was there. And I did all the things that I was able to do on my own with all the English language speakers. So again, this was part of the planning. It was like, okay, that 10-day period, it will be stuff that I don't need kind of necessarily my handheld for, which was the rest of it for sure. And then it was kind of, I was ticking off a lot of the politicians in Windhoek, and I spent 2 weeks in Windhoek. And then when we finally met, it was time to then head into the harder places to cover, speaking to the people affected. And I just remember the challenge for me being obviously that it was all abstract to me at that point, because I was being told how bad it was by the politicians, and I'd read how bad it was, but I hadn't seen any of this yet, because I wasn't going to go and look at this on my own. I think that would have both been irresponsible, and also I wouldn't have been able to properly get what I was wanting from that. And so when we did finally meet, it really just felt like from then on, I think we spent sort of 21 of the next 22 days together, just kind of in various different parts of Namibia. And I just remember being very eager to get started, because I just had all of this kind of, like I said, abstract, theoretical understanding of a sanitation crisis without having ever actually looked at one. So us meeting was the chance for that, for the story to really hit that kind of second stage, the most important part by far. So it was a challenge for me, I suppose, both of us juggling other lives that we had to both be living at the same time of the first third of this reporting, and also just being desperate and really kind of, and it does it does mess with your mind sometimes to really sort of just really want to move to the next stage, and kind of having to be patient, which I'm just generally not one of my skills at all. So yeah, so those were challenges that I thought, but generally once we met, it was like, okay, now I'm far more excited because I just had 10 days of sitting around tables with people talking about something that was about 4 miles away, but that I wasn't seeing yet. So that was hard, but.
And Sonia, do you want to add in on that? Any of the challenges you experienced, or did you also feel it was largely smooth sailing?
Yes. I had really encountered some difficulties throughout the executions of the project. But what helped mostly during the time is the communications, you know, and the great respect that we have for each other, me and Freddie as well as Margaret. I was going through some personal problems, which I had to be, you know, brutally honest with my colleagues so that they just know where I stand. And what I was going through at the time, which they eventually understood, and this made our work easier. I remember, I think in the last 2 weeks of executions of the project, I had to travel with my daughter. And it was really not that easy. I had to pull in and rope in someone to take care of my daughter while we go on the field with Freddie and I. But it's just the communication, it really helped us very well. But in terms of working together in the field, we all shared a common interest, which was obviously to approach this project heads on and do it well to the best of our abilities. We wanted, and we were so hungry to obviously to execute it very well. So we showed that in our duties in executing, and we pulled off the project, and just helping to make the work easier. Other than that, I would say maybe the language barrier. Part of the northern of Namibia, there's a language that I do not know well, but I had a friend that is based there that also helped, to translate for us, and it helped really well. So we didn't really encounter. I think Freddie, if you would agree with me, there were a few people that were, resistant to speak to us, just a few, but eventually we were able to convince them, and they were able to talk to us. So yeah.
Yeah, just to add 2 things there. First of all, that just on that last point, because we started booking in those interviews months in advance that we even got them. I mean, the idea of it would have been absolutely impossible to have shown up in those interviews because there was weeks and weeks before we get a response. So there was a lot of resistance. And yes, and we talk about this team as though it was Sonia and I and Margaret and the CCIJ team, but actually there were people on the ground who also helped us throughout this project. And in the north especially, and our colleague there actually was somebody who I also remained in contact with, because while Sonia was still in Namibia, she's still 7 hours drive away from the north, and there was follow-up that I needed to do in Rundu, in the northern part, in the border with Angola. So I would still message him and say, could you just clarify this detail? Could you, we were still in contact long after, 6 months after of me checking things.
Yeah.
He helped me to get the phone number of a local school teacher, and these kinds of things. So it becomes collaborative beyond your core team. But obviously these are connections made through Sonia because she just knew someone through the Namibian, and so it just becomes vital. The other thing is talking about, I think it was the determination and the joint goal to tell the story and just being really dedicated. There were definitely moments where I do think that it would have been easy to have just thought, we cannot do this particular part of the reporting because the circumstances around it are too hard. And you were talking there about, traveling with your daughter, and we did a 14-hour round trip in a car, so 2 7-hour drives with two, I think at the time, I think 3 and 4 year olds in the car, to make sure we could get to this place in the north that we were only going to for 3 days, because we thought this is the area where it's most impoverished and the sanitation is apparently worse. So we have to get there. It would have been easy to just think we just can't get there because of the circumstances. But I do think that you kind of just enter these projects, especially these big collaborations, with just a kind of open mind with, you know, there is going to be at least one potential catastrophe or disaster. And we didn't have that catastrophe, but there were challenges. But never was it enough to really sort of throw us properly. But, you know, I kind of went there assuming that it'd be much more difficult than the difficulties we faced, which was still pretty difficult. So I guess.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I appreciate all of that. And I mean, one of the things I will say I find so valuable, particularly about your collaboration, is that when one person is busy, the other with something else, the other person is still working. Like, you were advancing the story all throughout that entire year. And as you said, you know, Sonia was in South Africa at the beginning of it, but you were able to do certain work without her, and that ability to kind of be each other's supports in terms of getting the work done. And then in terms of the, you know, whatever personal life challenges, it's, you know, I hate to call it the buddy system, but there really is an advantage to it. I want to make sure we have time to get through all the questions and have time for Q&A. So I'm going to advance beyond the reporting phase now. Once you have finished reporting, how do you approach the writing with someone else? Did you divvy it up and each write separate pieces? Did one of you take lead? I mean, as I said at the top, sometimes there are real differences in writing style. I mean, you don't have to be from different countries to have differences in writing style, but it can be even more acute. So I don't know, Freddie or Sonia, who took lead, but whichever one of you wants to jump in, feel free.
Well, I just say something quickly there is that I was very conscious of the fact that Sonia was going back to a full-time job and is a parent. So, and I am just some freelancer who had basically cleared my calendar. So I just had the capacity. So I was more than happy to kind of, I just had more time, I think Sonia would agree. I mean, I just had time on my hands, and that's a very lucky and like privileged position to be in, to be able to dedicate just to this project in a way that, you know, Sonia was as dedicated as I was, obviously, but it was, I just had the actual time on my hands to sit down at a computer all day and think about it. So I thought the division of work was essentially me with the Word document essentially, and Sonia on the ground doing all the follow-ups and the tidying ups and chasing and stuff like that, which felt to me like a great division of responsibilities, because I had the space to just sit at my computer all day, and Sonia was able, and still with her kind of connections to everyone on the ground, keep chasing people and make sure we got these little voices and that we were missing. Is that your experience of it as well, Sonia?
Yeah, I would say so. I had so much on my hands. And by the time, I think one of the things that we also strategized was to write up notes. Who said what, you know, and we divided all that in categories. People on the ground, which area. So, like for example, on the west coast of Namibia, in Swakopmund, the notes that we took from there, we separated them. The ones from the north, we separated them. The central, we separated them. So by the time Freddie was gone back, we already had, you know, notes that were typed up on the soft copy, and you know, like he mentioned, we didn't do separate pieces. It was one investigation that was done together. But obviously later our editors then divided. They saw that we had so much information, and it can't be one story. So they divided it up in 3 pieces, which came out as a wonderful investigation finally. But the issue of 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 um, of finishing the investigation. Freddie really did the most there, because I had to go back to my full-time job, and I just didn't have so much time. But I was still with him, with the pending issues that still needed to be done. I had to get involved.
Yeah. And I know, Sonia, as much as you're saying you have to go back to your full-time job, you were still very involved, because there were a lot of follow-ups, particularly if I remember correctly, with government ministers that we had to go back and get more comments from. And you were incredibly essential in making sure that that happened. As you know, sort of said at the top, Freddie was there once. Freddie didn't go back to Namibia multiple times. So Sonia was really key to any additional reporting that needed to be done happening. And that's why having her as a locally based Namibian journalist was so essential. I want to also take a little bit of a step back. And Freddie, maybe we can start with you on this one. Looking back at the series, which had significant impact and relatively quickly. I mean, in investigative journalism, sometimes you do stories and you wait for years for someone to sort of pick up the mantle and react to them. Here you had more sort of, I'll say, instant gratification, and that the Namibian government did react and did take ownership of a lot of this issue. Looking back on it, do you feel like the collaborative approach was the best approach? And if you could go back and do the Namibia story all over again, is there anything you would have done differently?
Yeah, the collaboration was just vital, really. I mean, it just doesn't exist without it. I mean, it kind of, I almost take it for granted, because there's just no point imagining a version of this project that didn't have these characters involved, including obviously Margaret, who isn't here, but it's totally brought to life by her photography, and that was a whole inspiring week spent with her as an aside. Things I do think that it's something I feel like I'd like to have done differently, but don't necessarily know how I could have changed my expectations in terms of I don't think I was prepared for the scope of how awful it was, and that kind of just fires you up, and it kind of just leads to, and again, a greater sense of impatience and obviously it's been kind of my first proper investigative project. I wasn't, I suppose, as conscious that these things can just take real time, and impact can take a lot of time, because you kind of just get upset, as I'm sure a lot of people in this call have, when they see the things they're saying, and they just think this is such a disaster, and then you just want to dedicate all your time to it, and then but obviously your projects are also at the mercy of everyone else's time, and all your sources' time, and then the publisher's time, and then it's just hard to then feel that get so wound up constantly, that obviously not everyone in the world is like as obsessed with it as you are in every given moment, which is how it feels at that time. And then, so yeah, I think I would have just better prepared myself by having been kind of like more understanding of timeframes, and just kind of done it. I suppose I dived into the project, but I didn't dive as heavily into the kind of context and expectations around investigative journalism as like a point of study. And I could have sort of probably made myself a bit more aware around that, to kind of tempered my expectations of certain moments of the project. In terms of the impact, obviously it's great, and we were saying things in a very, the investigation was comprehensive and brought together what had been said in parts by many people over the last 20 years, including some politicians, but in scattered, messy, poorly financed and poorly paid attention to ways. And we kind of just brought that all together in a way that I do think was difficult to ignore. Somebody essentially just pulling together a dossier and saying how badly a government has messed up, in ways that others had touched upon for certain. And I mean, by others, I don't mean other journalists. I mean, the UN, for example, had touched upon this, but without that kind of the pictures that bring it all to life, and all of that. So I'm very happy with that. I do think, just a final point on what I would have done separately, that I do think was just a thing that I was missing. There was so many documents that I didn't read before I got there because I didn't know they existed, because it's hard to find things that you don't know exist, obviously, but so much hidden bureaucracy that was available online that I couldn't find before we got there. It would have been so much easier to. I do find that one of my shortcomings in interviewing a lot of the politicians I spoke to was that I didn't have all the information in which to really slam them because I couldn't find it. And I have wished I had gone in really even deeper in that pre-research phase that I do think was largely successful, but I thought it was going to be bad. And then it turned out it was even worse than we thought. And then that kind of involved us having to reshape what we thought the entire project was going to be. And I'd sort of have some regrets over not having found Namibia's 2018-2022 sanitation plan online before I went, but I didn't know it existed because they hide these things so well. It's so buried on websites that don't work. So that annoys me still, that I didn't see that, but it's probably obviously being harsh on myself, but I do think there were things I could have done in those two realms.
I will say, just Sonia, before you jump in as well in this question, as an editor, I think one of the things I enjoy the most is as reporters make like big discoveries and they sort of bring them to you and are excited to talk to you about them. And I feel like Freddie and Sonia, there were so many points along this way where it's like, oh my God, Yafa, we just found this document. And it was this like aha moment and added layers of complexity. So I didn't necessarily view it as a negative thing. If anything, it was the deepening of reporting that you couldn't necessarily have gotten to these documents another way. So you don't necessarily need to self-flagellate. And like I said, from an editor's perspective, it's actually really exciting as you kind of watch it from a distance. But Sonia, I'm curious to hear from you if you thought this collaborative approach worked, and if there's anything you would do differently.
I think for me, like Freddie said, the collaborative approach was very, very essential to this project. I don't think it was going to be pulled off by one person only. I wouldn't do it alone. I wouldn't be able to do it alone. Freddie wouldn't do it alone. So that collaborative efforts from the both sides was really, really important and essential. And I do appreciate the teamwork from the CCIJ. It's not only the two of us whose names are on the investigation, but there's a big team that is behind it. Like, Yafa said or mentioned, there are designers, there are 2 or 3 editors behind that. The data had to be put together. We had the photographer, Margaret, who did very, very impressive work with that. So for me, I think one of those things that, also Freddie mentioned is we were a bit overwhelmed with the information that we got. Even by the time we had the soft copy before the published series, we had so much information and we didn't know what should be where, and but with the help of our editors, then they realized that we had to split the investigation into 3. So in terms of what I could have done probably different, I don't think there's something that I would change. I just wish that I didn't have to Freddie didn't have to be alone at the beginning when I was in South Africa, but the constant communication between us actually helped, because I was also showing him and telling him that you can do this, or approach this person this way at this time. So I was sometimes arranging meetings for him and talking to people as well before we met in person. Yeah, I think everything, I wouldn't really change much. Everything went well. But I like after the publications of the investigation, I like the way the overwhelming support from people on the ground when they saw the published story. in the newspapers, because in Namibia, on the day of the publication, I think about 4 media or 5 media houses published the same story on that day. It was just really overwhelming, the support from people that, you know, this kind of investigation, you know, no one has ever done an investigation like this on this topic. And I also like the fact that you know, government officials came out and, you know, they were making calls. Yeah, we are going to do this, we are going to do that. You know, it then raises questions. Why do you want to do this only when, you know, the information is out there, when it's published in the media, when it's now being read? You know, why haven't you, you know, made, you know, initiations to try to address the situation beforehand? So yeah.
Yeah, like I said, I think, you know, it's so rare in investigative journalism you have immediate impact, but what was amazing was the immediacy of it. And to Sonia's point, when we talk about republication efforts, I mean, we published this 3-part series over 3 days, and each day these Namibian newspapers ran the same part together. So it was sort of the serialized experience that everyone across the country was reading. And my suspicion is that was really what put the pressure on the publications in Namibia, and sort of seeing it across the papers, the consistency of it really kind of turned the pressure up. I have one more question, and then we'll open it up to others. Sonia, we've talked less about this, so maybe I'll start with Freddie, and feel free to jump in if you've done this too.
Yeah.
How
Yeah.
has this collaborative journalism experience impacted the way you approach collaborative journalism or cross-border journalism and other projects? I know Freddie has been back to the continent several times and has worked with other African reporters since. But Freddie, maybe let's start with you. What lessons did you take from this experience into other collaborative projects?
Yeah, I suppose that's so less than a year after I returned and spent about a month in Malawi, where I was covering the long-term impacts of extreme weather events with another CCIJ member, and nothing on this kind of scale. And these weren't sort of these, you know, year-long investigations. These were kind of 2,000-word essays on some level set of government failings, but generally sort of food systems and agriculture. But the point being that I did, I think, 2 days of on-the-ground reporting with Jennifer Changwanda, who's a CCIJ member, and we wrote over the next 6 months after I went back to, I left Malawi 2 weeks after those 2 days of reporting. And over the next 6 months, we wrote 4 different stories for a number of Western publications, and that were also published in Malawi on these topics. And we still to this day have only spent less than 24 hours together, but we've got 4 joint bylines on these 4 pieces that I'm really proud of. And again, we've kind of developed this really nice collaborative system where she will message me and tell me something that's happening on the ground. She'll go off and do a few hours of reporting in that place in Malawi. I will contact the sources I have in NGOs and the politicians and things like that, and do that stuff. And between us, we write it, send it off, and it's done again. So that's 4 stories. We've met for less than 24 hours, but you're able to do these collaborations, is what I've learned, without your own presence. And we talk about kind of overcoming parachute reporting, which is absolutely vital. And I don't just mean that in a way that Western journalists fly in and don't work with a local journalist, or I mean that it's not, you don't even need to fly in at all. Even if you are working with a local journalist, it's perfectly possible to just have their phone number and do this as a collaboration. You know, there are very few people you have to actually get around a table with for an interview. The people on the ground are the ones you need to speak to for most stories, and Jennifer does that in Malawi, and I speak to all the people. Yeah, definitely what I'm doing is far less fun, I guess, because it's just phone calls to politicians. But we still are creating stories that make an impact, and that's ultimately, you know, the only thing anyone should really care about, I suppose, anyway. So this project taught me, I suppose, definitely the 6 months after I left Namibia, where we probably did as much reporting in the 6 months after as we almost did in that month, in terms, maybe not on the ground stuff, but like just speaking to the people and voices that we were missing. And I wasn't there for any of that, and it's a success. And then I had the same experiences in Malawi, and I've been put in touch with, I've done a story about sanitation in Zambia this year. I've never been to Zambia, and I did it with a Zambian journalist called Kennedy. Again, I brought my knowledge of sanitation and cholera, and he did the reporting on the ground. And crucially, both of us are credit on that story equally and equally paid. You know, it definitely would have been in my capacity to just paid him as a fixer, but this is part of the same problematic model, I think, and that relation. And I'm going to go to Zambia at the end of October and meet this guy, and we're going to do more stories together. So again, there's just so many different things you can do with these cross-border collaborations. You can be there, you can not be there, but the point is that it really elevates work that otherwise people don't bother telling, because they just think, well, I can't afford the flights or whatever. I mean, don't need to go. So I do think that's what I've learned from it.
Yeah. And Sonia, have you done any cross-border collaborative work since the Namibia project that you want to mention?
No, Yafa, I have not. I have not. But what I've learned, you know, the lessons I've learned from doing this, you know, project with Freddie, for the CCIJ is that you can't do it alone. And that team effort is really essential to bring to life an investigation like this one. You know, I've also informations on the topic you or investigation that you want to work on. And the other thing is just patience on the ground. You will encounter people that operate differently from how you do things. Sometimes when you are working alone, you want to do things faster so that you can just get it over with. But some people, you know, they are just too slow. You know, the way they respond, the way they, you know, you have to come back maybe tomorrow just to get the information, you know, and so on. But you know, working with Freddie also. Looking back at that, I didn't just gain, you know, a colleague that I can work with on future projects, but I think I've also gained a friend, because even after, you know, Freddie I flew back to we kept constant communication, and we check up on each other, you know, now and then. So yeah.
I think that's a wonderful way to end our portion of it. I'm conscious of time. Do folks have questions? If so, feel free to use the raise your hand emoji or just jump in. We have a couple of minutes for those. Quieter bunch this morning. Well, I will say, we will be sharing this presentation with everyone. Fola, our marketing manager, who I believe is on, organized all the logistics around this. She will be following up with it. And we're happy. I'm certainly happy to share my email address, Freddie and Sonia. If you are as well, that would be great. And if folks want to reach out on an individual basis, they can. Oh, yes, Stefan. Oh, you're on mute.
Perhaps just one belated question, comment. I'm not sure what it is, but I think what we saw here was that a collaboration with two key people worked very well. So you had two core reporting staff, obviously backed by a much larger team, but those key reporting people, they had some chemistry going. And they also had a neat solution to the writing problem, which often is a real problem. You know, when people have different writing styles, how do you harmonize that? Do you harmonize it? Do you write different pieces and publish differently, which you may or may not do depending on what the setup is? So I was wondering whether anyone here has any insight on how to manage larger collaborations, larger cross-border collaborations, where you might have reporting staff in a few different countries, where you have more egos, where you have more kind of custom and other kinds of differences.
Yeah. I mean, I can speak a little bit from my own experience, having worked on Panama Papers, and I'm now in my other role, not at CCIJ, also doing a collaboration, again, across, I think, 4 or 5 countries, 4 or 5 newsrooms in different countries. We're just getting, in Panama Papers, when we got to the writing portion, this was particularly interesting. I worked on the African portion of it, so at least I was on the same continent. And so some of there were differences, but they weren't as extreme as I sometimes find between like European and American standards. But one of the things we did with Panama Papers was there was sort of the people part of Panama Papers and there was the policy part of Panama Papers. And what we tried to do was figure out like who are the best narrative storytellers in our group who can really kind of get you into the characters who are offshoring their money in the case of Panama into all sorts of fun islands like, you know, the Seychelles, Mauritius, Madeira sort of thing. And who are the people who want to get into the weeds of like heavy tax policy and talk about what's illegal or legal, what are loopholes that can be closed. It's usually not the same person. I mean, the magical reporter who can do all of that well, you know, is a little bit of a unicorn to me. But that was what we really tried to do, like ID who was better at what, and have them each kind of own that piece of the writing. And as editors, we tried to kind of smooth the transitions between it. So it probably did feel at certain points like there was more than one voice writing, which we were okay with because there was also more than one byline. But we wanted that like the sections themselves felt coherent and cohesive. So people owned different pieces. And for us, it was sort of the people versus policy. But Sonia, were you about to say something? Or maybe you're just...
No, sorry.
Yeah. And then the other piece that I'll say on one that I'm working on now, we each are taking a piece of a larger story. So if you brought our 4 puzzle pieces together, you'd kind of have the complete story. But individual newsrooms are sort of owning their piece and their story. So rather than have like 4 reporters across 4 newsrooms tell the same story, they're each telling kind of the localized version of it that collectively tells a larger story. So that way you're not actually trying to kind of make such a cohesive thread across all of them, but there still is that element of it. I don't know if that's helpful.
I think that certainly is. But I think in my experience, it often depends so much on what the actual structure is of what you're trying to achieve. So as you say, with a kind of the Panama Papers or whatever, it is a very structured thing. It's kind of tightly controlled, tight rules and so on. Often you have a very different thing, you know, one reporter chasing a story. It happens to lead across a border. They need collaboration on the other side of the border. Then you've got to negotiate, how do you share that story? Who takes ownership of what? And then, as I say, when it comes to the publication, the harmonization is often the hard part.
Totally. And I will say, I think a lot of the onus is still on the editors in those projects because I do a lot of project management. Folks at CCIJ all do. And you have to have one, I have found you have to have one editor who's really driving the bus on it. And you have other editors who are a piece of the storyline. But when you have sort of 2 or more kind of dueling editors or editing fiefdoms, that's when I've encountered the most tension. What's nice about CCIJ, we have this sort of 3-prong approach of the person who focuses on the words, the person who focuses on the visuals, and the person who focuses on the data. And we kind of consider each other equal parts. But even within that, we always have a project manager who, if they're not one of those 3 people, is someone like Nelly, Kalu, who I think was on here, she may not still be, who manages the project management, who keeps people to deadlines, who uses our sort of organizing database to make sure that we're moving along. But I say this so much in my day-to-day work, it's like the editor has to own it, and there has to be buy-in that editor is sort of the one taking lead, because at the end of the day, you're the one who has to make the tough calls on what gets included and what doesn't, and that sort of thing. But yeah, I'll just tease out, we do have another training. This one was delayed. It was supposed to be in August. We do have another training later this September. The exact date is still to be determined, led by one of our data fellows, Yushi, about how to navigate large quantities of documents and data when you're doing investigations, which I think will be really useful. I know Yushi's coming off of working on a series of stories on the Nigerian election in which there is more data and documents than you can imagine. But I do want to flag, if you enjoyed today's training, if you like these kinds of trainings, consider CCIJ membership. We have a sliding scale, and we'll keep you in the know. We have a newsletter that goes out that Fola, our marketing manager, sends out. And if you've been hearing about this Namibia story and actually want to read it, I did include that link as well. Like I said, the presentation will be shared, but it really is a beautifully photographed story, so visually quite compelling, and then I think really carefully and thoughtfully told by Freddie and Sonia. So that's all I've got for today, but thank you everyone so much for joining, and again, thank you for coming a week later. We're so sorry about the scheduling snafu last week.